Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
I got my bags packed and on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 810. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about plantations and civil rights, Indian mounds and music history, Helen Keller, and Elvis, as we drive the Natchez Trace Parkway.
Be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome, the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Let's talk about the Natchez Trace Parkway. I'd like to welcome to the show Kristin Luna from camelsandchocolate.com, who has come to talk to us about neither camels nor chocolate, but about a road trip in the American South. Kristin, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Glad to finally be a guest.
And Kristin and I have known each other for so long, we have no idea how long we've known each other for. But she started travel blogging in 2007, so it was probably sometime after that. And we're talking today about the Natchez Trace. And Kristin, what is the Natchez Trace and what's your connection to it?
So the Natchez Trace Parkway is 444 miles of federal parkway that travels from Tennessee through Alabama and ends in Natchez, Mississippi. My connection to it is the fact that I am a Southerner who was looking for more ways to travel safely the past few years when I was stuck at home. And there was this iconic route that the American Indians took centuries ago that I had never done. So my husband and I started exploring it in chunks by car over the past 3 years. But it is a road trip that anyone can take if they have a week or 10 days or however long they're willing to dedicate to it.
And I have driven it, but a lot faster than that, and
Yes.
not the whole amount. So you could drive it, but you've really explored it, which is what I'm going to enjoy about this particular episode. But why should someone do the Natchez Trace?
I've come to find that so many Americans, even people that I'm friends with, have not explored a lot of the South because maybe they're from one of the coasts and it just seemed more inaccessible, or maybe they never had a reason to go to Mississippi. We're in this era of people want to find alternate ways to still travel safely, maybe to avoid spending a lot of time in airports, especially right now, and just do something that has a little bit of a history or cultural travel connection to it, which I think is why Natchez Trace Parkway is so applicable for right now, because the Natchez Trace Parkway explores American Indian history, civil rights history, and there are all these pivotal times in American history that a lot of us, including myself, didn't necessarily learn about in U.S. schooling. So I think it's a really great opportunity to educate yourself while seeing some of the prettiest deserted land in the southern U.S.
Well, and I've done this before on this show, but I'll do it again, I'm sure, in the future as well. As someone who did not grow up in the South and who may have grown up with a few impressions of the South, having grown up in the 60s and watching a lot of the civil rights protests and unrest and things happen on the TV at night, a Southern road trip was not high on my list, and I wish I had done one sooner, because I did not know how much I would enjoy road tripping in the South. Listen up if you think that this isn't for you. Maybe it is. And Kristen, what kind of itinerary are you going to recommend for us?
I think the Natchez Trace Parkway can be done in as much time as you have. Maybe you only have a short amount of time like you did. You'll be driving more, but you'll still be seeing some really
Mm-hmm.
beautiful hallowed land. There's a lot of burial sites, Native American mounds along the way that you can stop and visit, civil rights battlefields, all these sort of iconic sites. But there are also a lot of cities along the way. So if you have more like a week to 10 days, you can easily do a route where you fly into Nashville. You start with a day or two in Franklin, Tennessee, which is my favorite part of Tennessee. And it picks up the Trace in Leapers Fork. You can drive down into Alabama where the Shoals and Muscle Shoals Sound is. And then you
Mm-hmm.
can continue on into Mississippi, hit up Tupelo, Elvis's birthplace, continue on to Jackson, and then you end in Natchez, Mississippi, which is the oldest settlement on the Mississippi River. And it's also where the southern terminus of the Natchez Trace Parkway is. So it goes all the way from Natchez, Mississippi, and then winds its way up through 3 states and ends in Nashville, Tennessee.
Okay. And you're recommending we go from north to south because we'll be going down the map and therefore better gas mileage, right?
Exactly. I think you could do it either way that makes
Mm-hmm.
sense for you, depending on if you're flying in and starting in either direction. Flights to Nashville from a lot of the US are very cheap usually. So that's a good airport to use as your hub. And then when you end in Natchez, Mississippi, it is a smaller area for getting flights out. But if you wanted to continue on, you could go another 2.5, 3 hours to New Orleans and end your trip there. Although
Right.
the Natchez Trace does terminate in Natchez, Mississippi.
So if we do from north to south, the first place you would recommend we stop is where?
So I would actually skip Nashville altogether for this trip. I love Nashville. I'm
We
from the
just
area.
covered it recently. That's okay.
Yes. So
Many
you can
reasons to
go
go.
do that on another trip. Yes, there's many reasons to go to Nashville, but I think it's like a separate long weekend trip. When you're doing the Natchez Trace, I think you start in Leapers Fork, which is just outside of Franklin, and it's probably only 45 minutes from the Nashville airport. So you can pick up a car if you're flying in, go there, stay in a cute little cottage right off the Trace, enjoy the artisan community there, explore Franklin, see the Civil War history, because there's a lot of battlefields. The Battle of Franklin was one of the bloodiest battles in the Civil War. So you can explore all of that, see Franklin's Main Street, stay in Leapers Fork, which is this tiny little town off the Trace, but it has so many art galleries and musical history and singer-songwriter nights. It's just a really cool place to get an intro to Tennessee, and it's super chill. So it's also an excellent spot to start a road trip from.
Okay. So we wake up having spent the night in Leapers Fork, and then where are we heading?
Okay, then you are headed south down the Trace, and you've probably got another 2 hours to go until you get to North Alabama in Muscle Shoals and Florence, Alabama. So collectively, the area is known as the Shoals. It's got Tuscumbia, Sheffield, Muscle Shoals, and Florence. It's all in this tiny little area that you could explore easily. But in addition to the musical history there, because so many great musicians got their start in Muscle Shoals, there's also the birthplace of Helen Keller, which is a fascinating building to go and see and take a tour of. There's the birthplace of W.C. Handy, and then there's also a Frank Lloyd Wright house, the Rosenbaum. So even if music isn't necessarily your thing, which who doesn't love music, you've still got other things to see like architecture, history, and then there's a lot of great parks, and it's right on the Tennessee River.
Okay, a little more detail for me as the one who didn't catch everything you were saying. So Helen Keller's
Yeah.
birthplace, I get Helen Keller. I remember her. A fascinating story. But you had somebody else's birthplace that I did not recognize.
W.C. Handy, who is an iconic American composer. He was known as
Okay.
the father of the blues. If you've ever been to Memphis,
Got it.
there is a lot of history that's tied to him. But he was actually born down there in the Shoals, so they still have a place that you can visit on the site of his birthplace. And then he eventually moved on to create a big career in Memphis for himself.
Okay. And then when you say a lot of people got their start at Muscle Shoals, I'm not sure that everybody knows what you're talking about when talking about Muscle Shoals. So let's get in a little more detail. So we're talking about an odd little recording studio in the middle of nowhere.
Correct. And I don't want to misquote who all is from there.
I'm seeing lists that include the Rolling Stones, Aretha Franklin, George Michael, Wilson Pickett, Willie Nelson, Leonard Skinner, Joe Crocker, Levon Helm, Paul Simon, Bob Seger, Rod Stewart, Tamika Jones, Cher, and Cat Stevens, which is quite a collection of people.
Yeah, I think that's the interesting thing about Muscle Shoals is that the Muscle Shoals sound is tied to a band called like the Swampers, and then there's a studio called Fame. There are a few studio tours that you can take down in Muscle Shoals, and they're tiny. Like, you can't imagine that these huge iconic artists like Aretha Franklin recorded there and got their start there, but so many of them did. And so for anyone who's a music historian or just loves music, there's plenty of things to do there so you can see where some of your favorite artists got their start. And there's also the Alabama Music Hall of Fame down there. But pretty much everyone you said has at least recorded there. And that's the crazy thing is they have all these instruments still in recording rooms where you can walk through and they'll tell you exactly what hits were recorded there. And it's just these tiny little studios off a drag attached to strip malls now. Like, you can't imagine that there were so many major musical artists there. But that's what I love about the Shoals is it's very unassuming, and it's not an expensive place to visit. It's a place that you can easily see in a weekend or a day, depending on how much time. And it is right there along the Tennessee River. So anyone who just loves outdoors and dramatic scenery will enjoy at least driving through there.
Cool. Anything else we want to say about the Muscle Shoals area before we progress?
If you do decide to stay overnight in Muscle Shoals, I would recommend Florence. There's a couple little boutique hotels along the main drag there, and there is a university, the University of North Alabama. So you've got a student culture, which always translates to cool little shops and bars and restaurants. So there's enough to pass your time for a full day in that area if you have the time to spend.
Did you want to recommend any of the hotels in particular?
I have stayed in the past at the Gunrunner Boutique Hotel and also the Strickland Hotel. They're both really cool, like smaller boutique properties where you're not going to really have to deal with crowds or someone keeping you up in the middle of the night. They're in charming old buildings in downtown Florence. Those are usually my go-to when I'm down there, but there are definitely plenty of vacation rentals, cabins, that kind of thing, if that's more your preference.
Okay, excellent. Where to next?
From the Shoals, you can travel into Mississippi, and there's an area called Tishomingo that was named for a Chickasaw chief, and he was one of the last full-blooded American Indians who held any power in the area. So that area has a really cool state park that Scott and I have gotten off before and done some hiking. There's rock climbing, there's fishing. If you're camping, which you can definitely do along the trace, they have some really great campgrounds, whether you're tent camping or renting cabins or doing the RV rental. So that's a nice little stopover between Muscle Shoals and Tupelo, which would be your next city of sorts along the Natchez Trace.
And that's the Tishomingo State Park, I assume.
Correct. Tishomingo State Park.
And when we say state park, we're in Mississippi now. We're in our third state.
Correct. And that is the crazy thing about the Natchez Trace is you start in Tennessee and you're not in Tennessee for that long. And then you go through a little section of Alabama. And then suddenly you're in Mississippi. And then the majority of your drive is going to be in Mississippi.
Right. Okay. What else are we going to do in that area before we hit Tupelo?
So once you leave Tishomingo, let's see, I'm looking at the map. This is another reason that probably like you, when you went to this Natchez Trace, it was tricky because there's so many stops along the way and you have to get off to find all this stuff. And even when I'm like researching it, and this is why I like documented it by mile marker on my blog, is it's still tricky to find everything. And I guess one tip you might want to include is if you're driving the Natchez Trace, there are a lot of sections where you don't have cell service. And the nice thing is you don't necessarily need it to navigate because it's just one long road you're driving. However, you want to do some advanced planning because you'll want to know what you want to get off the trace to do. So it's nice in that you don't necessarily have to know where you're going to just put the car in drive, put it on cruise control, because if you are speeding It is a federal parkway, and that comes with a hefty ticket. But you don't expect to have service. Don't expect to be able to stream your favorite
Right.
podcast or your favorite music service. So definitely prepare for that, because that's something, no matter how many times I've driven this area, every time it still shocks me. I'm like, oh, for 3 hours, I didn't have any cell service. But if you are leaving Tishomingo going to Tupelo, you will pass an Indian mound. It's Far Mounds, a complex of 8 mounds over 90 acres. There are 6 Indian mounds total on the Natchez Trace. So
Okay.
you can stop at any point that you see one that interests you. Some of them are a little bit off the trace. Like, you will see a sign that's
Ah bon chien. Bonjour, je suis Theo, a tour leader with Explore, and this is Punti. He's helping us find truffles under the trees next to this beautiful vineyard. Maybe for tomorrow's cooking class? We call it semi-heure. Parfait. Semi-o'clock. Not everyone gets to enjoy a Bordeaux sunset this way, but you will if you explore. No, Punti. Search exploreworldwide.com and don't just travel. Explore.
directing you off the trace, but it's not like you can just literally pull off. Sometimes you might have to drive a mile or so of winding around before you get there. But the National Park Service website actually has a lot of the historical sites mapped out there. So that's a good site for reference if you want to if there's something you're interested in, like Indian mounds, and you want to find them all in one place and know where to go, you can look on their site for that.
And we should say, if people haven't visited Indian mounds, they're obviously very culturally and historically significant, but on the other hand, they're mounds of dirt. So don't set your expectations really high in terms of what it will look like. It's not that it's a stunning site so much as an important historical site.
Exactly.
My guess is people won't stop at every one.
Yeah, so then that's the thing, is there's 6 along the way, and if you just want to see one and see what it's all about, there are a few different options for that. The Emerald Mound down near Natchez toward the end of the trace is probably one of the better ones to visit, in my opinion, because it does have some good historical signage for people who haven't visited this type of thing before and really want to get more of that background.
Yeah, and that would be the why they built it, how they built it sort of thing.
Correct, yes.
Got it. Okay. Excellent. Where to next?
Next, we are going to Tupelo, which is home to a little-known artist named Elvis Presley. You may have seen the new movie about him. Have you seen it?
I actually
Chris?
have not seen a new movie about Elvis Presley.
It is fantastic. It has done very well at the box office, and I think it's filled this hole in what people knew about his life from the time he was born in Tupelo until he obviously moved to Memphis and became a global name. But Tupelo is where he was born. You can still see the house where he and his twin, who passed away at birth, were born. And there's all sorts of Elvis tours and trail markers and murals, just everything you can imagine around the town of Tupelo. Even if you're not an Elvis fan, it's just really cool to see, because they've got a great Main Street, a downtown area that just has so many historical sites, like an old hardware store where Elvis's first guitar was purchased, an old department store that's still functioning. Even if you're sitting there rolling your eyes, okay, I've had enough Elvis, I think it's still a cool town to at least drive through. But I personally love it, and I've been wanting to go back because there's a brand new boutique hotel in Tupelo called Hotel Tupelo, and I've been wanting to go back just to check it out. And I'm sure it has plenty of Elvis memorabilia infused in it, but a very neat town in Mississippi that's going to be different than the vibe you're getting elsewhere on the trace.
Got it. Anything else we're doing in Tupelo?
You can't go to Tupelo and not catch that vibe and get really interested in what he did for music. One thing to note is that his inspiration was the Black community in Tupelo. His roots were in the gospel church. And so you can still kind of experience that in your visit to Tupelo. The Tupelo Visitor Center is located on the former site of the Shake Rag neighborhood where Elvis would go to that Pentecostal church and kind of feel the music and really get into singing. And they have really cool, like, stations where you can listen to music and see the Elvis's Tupelo story. If you've seen the movie or read anything about him, he was really inspired by superheroes. Captain Marvel Jr. was his icon.
I did
And
not know this. Okay.
that's why he wore the capes and everything. And I learned all
Huh.
this through my time in Tupelo. I was not an Elvis historian prior to my visit, but the visitor center is really cool because they have all of this history that you can go and visit for free, and you can see this through graphic, almost like graphic novel interpretations they've done, and listen to the music. And then there's all sorts of an Elvis guitar trail, an Elvis driving tour. You can pick up maps to do all of this on your own. So definitely the Elvis fan needs to go, but I think anyone driving the Trace should at least stop over for a night in Tupelo.
And I found a very interesting blog post on this site. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Camels and Chocolate about Tupelo, that has a lot of very colorful things, including a meadery and places like that in Tupelo.
Yes, I love a colorful town. I love myself a mural, and there's quite a few murals in Tupelo. But yes, the meadery, Queen's Reward Meadery in Tupelo, was the state's first meadery. And anyone who likes adult beverages should stop by there and try it, because it's only been open for a few years, and I think that they've had a pretty big impact on that area.
Excellent. Where to next?
So, leaving Tupelo, you're going to be headed south toward Jackson. There are a few places you can stop along the way, like French Camp, which is an old historic village, and it has cabins, a small bed and breakfast, and other places you can visit there. Did you happen to stay there when you were driving the Trace at all?
No, we really did it as a day trip. We were in Huntsville. After the T-Bex Huntsville, my wife flew in and I showed her all around that fun city. And then we were heading down to Vicksburg. And it just happens to be that a lot of the drive in between can be done on the Natchez Trace. So we were really just driving the Trace for a day.
Got it. So French Camp is this old-timey feeling, like historic village there's like kind of a dining hall you can eat in, and you can stay in this little log cabin that has a dozen or so rooms, and you eat breakfast all in kind of this common area. It feels a little bit like summer camp, and my husband and I stayed there for a night when we were transiting between Tupelo and Jackson, and we met so many bikers on the Natchez Trace because it's such a popular bike ride for people who are serious cyclists, which is not me, but people love to bike the whole thing or sections of it, and they will stay at places like French Camp along the way that do cater toward those cyclists who have all their gear with them and need a place to stay but maybe don't want to camp. So that was a really cool place to go, because we actually got to meet a lot of other travelers, because it felt more like the hostel vibe, which I haven't gotten since my years of backpacking in Europe, because U.S. travel just isn't like that. You're in a hotel, you're in Airbnb. We don't really have hostels. And I liked that about French Camp, is that we were able to meet a lot of people from, there was a big group from Mill Valley when we were passing through there. And my husband and I got married in Marin, so it was really fun talking to them and finding out that they all flew out from Mill Valley to bike from Nashville to Natchez, Mississippi, which I prefer driving, to each their own. When you're leaving French Camp, the next big spot you will hit along the way is the Ross R. Barnett Reservoir. So there are a lot of places along the Trace where you can do recreational water sports, like rent a boat or go paddleboarding, canoeing, kayaking. That's one of the largest waterways that we stayed at along the way. We stayed in this town called Ridgeland. The town of Ridgeland is just off the reservoir and just north of Jackson. It's more of a suburban vibe, but for people who want to stay over and do water sports, it's a great place to stop over. And it also is home to Bill Waller Craft Center, which is the headquarters of the Craftsmen's Guild of Mississippi, which I didn't know what I was getting into when I went there. This was this massive art center, like literally right off the Trace. You could be walking the Trace and just step a few feet off, and it goes up to the entrance of the Craftsman Guild of Mississippi, the Bill Waller Craft Center. And so I was just thinking, my mother-in-law is a big weaver and knitter, and it's just rife in like textile art, and ceramics. You can take classes there. You can shop from, I think, 300 artisans in the area who sell their creations there. For anyone who just loves arts and crafts or wants to learn more about that influence on the area, it's a great stop to make. And so it's also a reason to stop over from French Camp to Jackson, because I do think a lot of people probably just hit the main cities on the drive to Natchez Trace, but there are over 24 communities along the way, and everything has at least an afternoon's worth of things to do.
Okay, interesting. And then we're in Jackson?
So then from Ridgeland, you are not far at all from Jackson, maybe 20 or 30 minutes.
Okay.
Jackson is, I think, maybe the next Huntsville. It's this gritty southern city that has a big creative entrepreneur vibe and a lot of kind of startups that are happening in the food and beverage space, a lot of street art, a lot of cool museums, and then, of course, one of the main things that people go to Jackson for is Mississippi Civil Rights Museum if you're a tourist. And that just absolutely blew me away. It's actually 2 museums in one. And it is a must stop for any traveler, whether you've studied the civil rights movement or you're an absolute newbie when it comes to learning about that period of history. I've been to the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. This was that caliber and just continued the story.
Okay.
It was so well done. I couldn't believe I didn't know about it until I went there. So definitely a must-do for anyone who is traveling the Trace. And that is something, if you only had a weekend and you're trying to cram all the Trace into it, that is one thing I would say to prioritize getting off of the Parkway for.
Okay. What else are we going to do in Jackson?
So Jackson also has a lot of art museums, like the Mississippi Museum of Art. There are plenty of musical experiences. We went to the Iron Horse Grill, which is this tavern style restaurant. And then you go upstairs and they have this entire expansive museum on their second floor, which I didn't even know about, but someone told me beforehand, make sure you go ask to do the Mississippi music experience. And it's the second floor of this restaurant. It's huge. It has wax statues like you're at Madame Tussauds, but it also has the history of Mississippi music from Delta blues to Elvis and everything in between. So that was a cool stop we made right before we got back on the Parkway. We really loved the Fondren area, which is a little artsy enclave in Jackson. They've got some public art. I think there was an old school I wanted to... When you went to Huntsville, did you do Campus 805, that old school?
I did, yes.
So they had something like that in Jackson that was really cool.
When you talk about Campus 805, we're talking about Huntsville, Alabama, and it has an old high school that has been turned into a nightlife spot with breweries and pizza places and at least one speakeasy that you have to roll back the lockers for. So you're talking about that kind of vibe.
Yes, there is a place called Dueling Hall in Fondren that is just this gorgeous old structure that's been remade into a multi-purpose kind of gathering space. It's got restaurants, live music, artist studios, that kind of thing. So if you're passing through Jackson and looking for the cultural heart of the community outside of the downtown, head to Fondren, go to Dueling Hall, eat at Saltine, and just see what else you find in that area. Okay. There's a couple places you can stay in Jackson if you kind of want the bed and breakfast vibe, like the Fairview Inn or the Capitol Inn. And of course, Jackson has all the big name hotels and some pretty cool Airbnbs as well. It's a very affordable place, which is also why I love it as a weekend destination, because your dollar goes further there.
I find that we haven't listed any destination, I think, on this itinerary that is an expensive destination, I think.
Correct. It's a great idea for someone with a family traveling with 5 or 6 people, because it is a more affordable trip to take.
Not counting gas prices right now. But
not counting gas prices, but I will say it is still more affordable in the South, gas prices, than, of course, on the coasts.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And if you're doing the full Trace, you're looking at 444 miles. So depending on what kind of car you have, you're looking at a tank and a half of gas if you're just doing it one way. So still more affordable than flying overseas, which is just ridiculous right now. And then when you're leaving Jackson, you have a couple different options. You could pop into the town of Clinton, which is not far at all from Jackson. It's probably about 20 minutes outside of Jackson. It's where the Clinton riots took place, which kind of started Reconstruction in the state. It has a lot of historical markers that also tell that story in the downtown and the Main Street community. They're really reviving that area to make sure that they tell the story. The thing about traveling the Natchez Trace Parkway or anywhere in the South is that it's fraught with all this history of the enslaved people and then the civil rights movement. I do think there are a lot of communities like Clinton that are making an effort to make sure that all of those stories are told and that they're not buried. And that's why I do like the idea of this trip right now, because I feel like we're at a time in history where there's so much division and people don't really understand where it all stems from. This trace is a really great kind of teaching moment for people who know nothing about the plantation era of the South.
Yeah, we're deep South now.
We're deep South, and it's not, none of this is really glorifying that plantation era at all. What I really love about going to Natchez, Mississippi, is that it is one of the areas in the South that kind of remained untouched during the Civil War. So a lot of other towns and regions were decimated, whereas Natchez, its buildings and its old historic homes are relatively preserved. So if you really want to see what life was like before all of this happened during the Civil War, it's almost frozen in time in a way, but the town is very progressive and it's very welcoming to like LGBTQ travelers. It's like a little mini New Orleans, but a 15,000 person town in Mississippi. Of all the places along the Natchez Trace, that and Jackson felt like the most progressive destinations to me. I think it's important that you see both sides of traveling in the South, obviously, because it's not all like that. But when we were there one night, for example, we went to this really cool like drag bingo show downtown, and we really got to see how big the gay community is in Natchez, which I loved to see as a Southerner. I will say that there's just a ton to do in Natchez that for anyone who likes to go out and do the nightlife side of things, it is like a miniature New Orleans without the crowds. And you can walk around easily. It feels very safe. It's all situated along the Mississippi River, and there's these dramatic bluffs that just cascade over into the river. So you can stay at one of the historic bed and breakfasts down by the river and kind of ditch your car and walk around for the majority of your time there. They do have an open cup policy like New Orleans does, where when you're in a certain part of town, you can walk around with your beer in hand or whatever. So if that's your vibe, it's a good place to do that.
Excellent. It sounds like that kind of wrapped up our itinerary from north to south here. Anything else you want to fill in? Don't forget, when you're in the Natchez Trace, you really should...
Don't forget, when you're in the Natchez Trace Parkway, you should download any maps or navigational devices you need before you start driving, because you will not have service for all long stretches of it. Don't forget to get off the trace, because you can get into autopilot when you're driving that long stretch of parkway, and there isn't a ton of signage for all these communities, so you do need to do a little bit of advanced planning and figure out where you want to go.
And I should point out, since I'm not sure Kristin will, that she has at least 4 different blog posts on this segment by segment that are marked by which mile marker. And marking things by a mile marker is a great idea for wherever you're getting information from, again, because you may not have access to your internet while you're on the trace. So print that out.
If you go to my site, camelsandchocolate.com, and you search Natchez Trace Parkway, I did document it mile by mile, only because I couldn't find a lot of sites that just listed the highlights when I was doing it. There are a ton of places you can stop over on the trace, but not necessarily all of them are going to be interesting to travelers, because it is a very storied byway that has been around long before modern day travelers. So there's so much history there, but not everything is going to be something you want to stop and see. So if you do want the mile marker itinerary, I do have it on my blog. Also,
Right.
the Natchez Trace Parkway, there's a great website for that. It's scenictrace.com. And then the National Park Service has a ton of information on their website, which I used when creating my itineraries.
Excellent. Anything else we want to say before we get to some of our wrap up questions?
I guess I didn't really talk about the food.
Okay.
I just made note of the questions that you normally ask. And what should you eat along the trace? This part of the South is very heavy in meat and three culture, which is usually a meat and three sides. So you'll find that, and you'll find soul food at a lot of the stops along the way. If you're a vegetarian, you might want to bring snacks because we are very heavy in the meat and threes here in the South. Same if you have any dietary restrictions, you are going to have to do a little bit more advanced planning because it's not so many vegetarian and gluten-free options as you might be used to if you're coming from a coastal area.
You can just eat the N3.
You can just eat the N3. You can just live on a diet of macaroni and cheese. I won't judge.
Hey, I think I just had that for dinner, so I'm glad you're not judging on that. It was good macaroni and cheese. It was homemade stuff, not the box stuff, just so for the record. If you're standing in the prettiest spot in the Natchez Trace Parkway, where are you standing at? What are you looking at, Kristin?
Ooh, that is a good question. Possibly the image that comes to mind when people think of the Natchez Trace Parkway is the Natchez Trace Parkway Bridge, which I didn't even mention before. That is at the start of the trace near the northern terminus in Leapers Fork, just outside of Franklin. So if you really want your dramatic photo of I have been to the Natchez Trace, that's where you go for that. I don't live that far from there, so for me, I see that site all the time. So as someone from Tennessee, I could not get over the sunsets in Natchez, Mississippi at the very end of the trace. So you hit that southern terminus sign, the last milepost if you're driving north to south, and then you get off and you go straight to the Mississippi River in Natchez, and it's just like the sunsets are unreal. So that is my favorite spot for a view along the trace.
One thing that makes you laugh and say only on the Natchez Trace Parkway.
Oh, I will say the most surprising thing to me is when we went to this town of Clinton, Mississippi, because everyone, including the mayor, just travels around by golf cart. So you're in this community off the trace, which you are looking at some of the most historically significant land for the Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Natchez Indians. And then you're driving through this town of Clinton, Mississippi, and everyone is riding around in golf cart waving at you. And it seems like everyone there knows when you're from out of town because they stop and talk to you. And I'm like, I'm from Tennessee. I'm not even like from that far away, but it's like you're walking around with a big signpost on you saying, I'm a traveler on the Natchez Trace, and they want you to have the best time ever there. I wasn't expecting to go to this cute little Main Street area and have everyone driving around the cobblestone ways by golf cart. So that did make me laugh.
Excellent. And if you had to summarize the experience of driving the Natchez Trace in 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
If I had to summarize the trace in 3 words, I would say it is expansive, surprising, and transformative.
Excellent. Our guest again has been Kristin Luna from camelsandchocolate.com. I have to ask, why camels and chocolate? I like camels and I like chocolate, but why camelsandchocolate.com? I don't know that I've ever asked you this.
Yeah, so I started my blog in 2007 before there was a concept of SEO. And
sure. You're talking to a guy named Amateur Traveler. So
I was trying to think of something that kind of summarized my travels. And to date, I had been known for this photo that was widely used at my university, which was University of Tennessee, and it was me on a camel. And when you win a photo contest and you don't realize you're signing away your rights for life, that happened to me. This photo of me from 2005 still circulates on the study abroad brochure. It was in the
Oh, funny.
alumni magazine. It was in the annual calendar, and University of Tennessee is a large university. When it first started coming out, I would get just an influx of calls or texts to me and my mom saying, "Oh, we saw Kristin, that camel girl, again. This month she's Miss May," the calendar. And so it was like that photo that haunted me. And from the beginning of my journalism career, I've always written a lot about food. And everywhere I went, I would seek out chocolate, like the best chocolate in the country or
Of
the
course.
city, of
There's no
course.
reason to explain that. Yeah.
Yes, possibly now that would be like beer and bourbon. Back then it
Okay.
was camels and chocolate. But so yeah, it's just stuck with me. And there are a lot of blogs out there, but I don't have to compete with my name for any of them, so I can say that.
Excellent. And I'll put links to Kristin's posts about the Natchez Trace to all of them, I think, actually, in the show notes for this article, so you can find them more easily. Kristin, thank you so much for coming on Amateur Traveler and talking about your love for the South and your love for the Natchez Trace Parkway.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
A special thanks to the patrons of this show who help support Amateur Traveler financially. I appreciate their help. They get the show a little earlier, and they also get an ad-free version of the show. And that means the chapters on their version will always work because we won't insert ads in that version. And we know that the inserted ads will break the chapters. We've learned that, so we're not doing inserted ads for the first month of the show on the regular feed. But you can always get those on the Patreon feed. If you're interested in becoming a patron of the show, you can go to patreon.com/amateurtraveler. So I did the episode on Silicon Valley, and when I promoted that show, I put out something that said, "Hey, after 17 years of podcasting, I'm finally doing a show in my hometown." And I heard from Paul, who said, "Crikey, don't scare me like that. Starting a post with, after 17 years of podcasting, usually ends with, I'm retiring. You're the last true travel podcast. Everything else has become, here's how to make money podcasting about travel and get free stuff as an influencer and digital nomad and 20 other buzzwords we're going to repeat over and over again until your ears bleed. Thank you for being consistently awesome." Paul, thanks. I'm actually going to speak up in defense of my fellow travel podcasters. If you want to make a living doing podcasting, then you do what a lot of the people who are doing those shows that you don't like are doing. You talk about points and miles, or you talk about a particular destination that you're selling tours to. Like, Rick Steves does a good show, but, he focuses on making money from tours. And then obviously other people who focus on tours do usually a smaller region and then do destination shows. Or you do focus on, how to make money as a blogger, because that's something that sells. If you don't want to make money, you do a show like mine where you talk about a different destination every week, which means it's harder to get sponsors to line up. If you did a show just on Italy, for instance, you could get a sponsor. Lou Mangello, who does a show on just Walt Disney World, has a whole lot more sponsorships and made a living from his podcast for, almost 15 years now. So there's a reason why there aren't as many shows like Amateur Traveler in terms of just destination focused and all over the world. And it's a pretty good business reason. I'm fortunate that I don't have to try and make a living from Amateur Traveler, and so I can do the show that I want to do. But cut a break to those who are trying to make a living off the podcast and are doing the shows that are more commercial. And I also heard from Jennifer on that particular show, who reminded me of things in my own backyard. It seems embarrassing, but Jennifer said, "My mother's side of the family was from this area, and I spent many happy childhood hours here, so I especially enjoyed this one. My favorite places were the San Jose Flea Market, Pachinko Palace, Lake Vasona, and of course, Great America." And Great America, I think I mentioned in the show, which is now actually going to be closing, but not for like 11 years or something like that, but it did sell. And San Jose Flea Market, I haven't been there in years and was reminded of it by Jennifer's comment. And yeah, it's a fascinating place. If you like to shop, if you like bargains, even if you don't like to buy stuff, but you just like to shop, the San Jose Flea Market can be awesome. With that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And thanks so much for listening.